Hi, everyone. My name is Charlie Maher. I'm with the ISP Boston chapter. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, FDA and Industry Panel Discussion, Biomanufacturing Innovation in a Regulated Industry. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our program sponsors, DPS Group, ICQ Consultants, Massey Bioservices. I'd also like to remind you of upcoming ISPE Boston chapter events. We have a webinar on streamlining tech transfer on Tuesday, June 18th. We have the annual chapter planning meeting on Wednesday, July 15th, and the ISPE Boston Product Show on Wednesday, September 16th. Please stay up to date on the latest chapter updates, events, and industry news by following ISP Boston chapter on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Today's webinar is intended to be an interactive dialogue featuring audience participation. The format is a discussion, and we will be crowdsourcing the questions via Pigeonhole. A link to Pigeonhole is included on the event confirmation email you've received. Just click on the link to get to the site. No password or login is needed. From there, you can enter questions to the text box by the upper arrow or vote for questions you want to have answered at the lower arrow. We've entered a few questions to get the conversation started, but we look forward to receiving questions and answers, questions from you to answer in our discussion. So let's turn to tonight's topic, FDA and Industry Panel Discussion, Biomanufacturing Innovation in a Regulated Industry. First, I'm honored to introduce tonight's panelists, Dr. Jeffrey Baker, Deputy Director, Office of Biotechnology Products, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, US FDA. Dr. Haroon Hashmi, Senior Vice President, Regulatory Science, Zyopharm Oncology. Warren Jarowitz, Associate Vice President of CMC, Manufacturing Supply Chain Quality, T-Scan Therapeutics. And Dr. Philip Wills, Chief Commercial Officer, Catalent Pharma Solutions. Before we jump into the panel discussion, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and offer a few opening remarks on tonight's topics. So Jeff, could you kick us off, please?
Sure. Hi, my name is Jeff Baker. I have been in the industry well over 30 years. I'm currently Deputy Director in the Office of Biotech Products in Cedar. I started my professional career at Eli Lilly, and I was there over 20 years in biotech development and manufacturing support. I moved on to Astrazeneca, where I was Senior Director for Manufacturing Sciences, and then was appointed Deputy Director in OBP. I should say at the outset that views expressed are those of the speaker and do not necessarily represent those of the owners and stockholders of your United States government. For official policy, go to fda.gov. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about this topic. I think that we're experiencing a very exciting time in biopharmaceutical development and manufacturing. And I think that the topic of application of innovation and manufacturing in the manufacturing space is very timely and in fact very, very important to not only the public health but to a number of national security matters these days. I think that it's important for us to have conversations about how we can engage the same vibrant, productive innovation engine that comes up with new and innovative products into the manufacture of those products. And I think that throughout the next couple of hours, we'll have an opportunity to explore how well that is working or not working, and what are hurdles and enablers to it. I mean, probably none of us have a cell phone that's more than a couple of years old, but if you know, Scotty from Star Trek suddenly beamed us into a randomly selected biotech manufacturing facility, I'd venture that we would be unable to tell what year it was, plus or minus 5 to 10 years, by looking around at a number of the unit operations. I think that's important for us to examine. Why is that? Is that okay? And if it's not, how do we make it better? And so these are very important discussions to have, and I thank the other panelists, and I thank ISPE for enabling an exploration of this topic.
Thanks, Jeff. Haroon.
Sure. My name is Haroon Hashmi, and I've been in the industry for over 20 years, mainly in regulatory science. I have worked in emerging markets, including US, Europe, and emerging markets like Asia-Pac region. Basically regulatory science, but I've also done a little bit on the project management side of things. So we have been in the large biotech company, for example, Biogen, and now currently at Zypharm, which is small in gene therapy and cell therapy. So I have seen some of the challenges of manufacturing from the perspective of big global companies as well as niche companies. So hopefully today's discussion will be helpful from the perspective, especially when we are talking about small companies with unique therapies like gene therapy, cell therapies. And some of you who may be working in this field understand the challenges of working not only in the orphan space, but in therapies which do not require a lot of lot manufacturing and batch manufacturing, and you have to do with sort of small scales and fewer lots as compared to having a lot of manufacturing history to go with it. So hopefully those perspectives will come into play as we embark upon these discussions.
Thank you, Haroon. Warren?
Warren Jaworowitz. I've 25 plus years in the industry at all stages of development, from the bench to commercial manufacturing. I've had the benefit of working on small molecules, biologics, complex dosage forms, orphan drugs, and cell and gene therapy most recently, and seen it at small biotech and large biotech. So a little bit of everything on the CMC front in my career. I'm really happy to be part of this conversation, and thank ISP for having created this opportunity. I think it's a very important topic. CMC is so important to what we do, and innovation and manufacturing is a key part of that. In my opening comments, I'd like to maybe state a few things I see as fundamental challenges to innovation, and that's when we think about clinically focused companies, they tend to be founded on exciting new science and not on exciting new manufacturing processes. And it's, I think, a fundamental challenge for second-order thinking, long-term thinking about manufacturing innovation when that's the premise for founding an organization. So incentivization or changing the value proposition there needs to be part of the plan for addressing the problem. I think also timelines are a pressure that we have, and timelines are often set before a risk-based CMC or manufacturing plan is in place. And so manufacturing is secondary to the conversation, and it's always framed by that initial anchoring of the initial time frame. There's little appetite for trying things new in those frameworks. I think also that CMC spend is often surprising to organizations. That includes manufacturing. And so when you're talking about innovation, one of the barriers that we're going to have to get past is the value proposition of potential payoff in the future for known costs now. So I'm interested to see where the conversation goes today and see what we can do to move the ball on some of these topics.
Thanks, Warren. Philip?
Yes, hi, I'm Philip Wills. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Catalent Gene Therapy. Was the Chief Commercial Officer at Paragon that then was acquired by Catalent around this time last year. I am responsible for business development and corporate strategy at Catalent Gene Therapy, but I am a scientist by training and have worked at the bench, but have leveraged that skills over the years on the business side. One area where, our focus is on gene therapy, and, one potential, improvement, technological revolution with respect to gene therapy that's, on the horizon, that would be interesting to hear what the panelists think about, how do we get that implemented and adopted as quickly as possible, would be the concept of a packaging cell line for AAV gene therapy therapeutics. Right now, the way that people make AAV is using transient transfection of cells at scale, and that really limits the scale of production, which obviously limits the cost effectiveness of your manufacturing platform. One way to alleviate that is the concept of a packaging cell line to manufacture these gene therapies, but that comes with potentially new processes, new cell lines, and a lot of these companies are very reluctant to take on the risk of adopting such a a difference in their manufacturing platform midstream. So I'm curious to hear what the panelists will be saying about how can we make incentivize both companies and the government to allow for the implementation of such a fundamental shift in a manufacturing strategy.
Thank you, Philip. I really appreciate that. And we're going to switch now to our question and answer format. So let's shift the screen around, and we're going to display Pigeonhole on this on the screen. I see that there's been some voting going on. I encourage everybody to get onto their their smartphones or onto their computer and do some voting. Put in your own questions. I'm going to go with one question, right off of Phil's conversation right there. I really thought it was pretty on point, and I just wanted to tee up one question here right to the point of that, is that first movers shoulder the high costs and risk to blaze the trail for biomanufacturing innovation compared to fast followers. Is that model sustainable? And what can we do to accelerate innovation by sharing cost and risk? And Phil, you kind of posed the question, so let me just give you the first shot at it to see what your thoughts are, and we can go around the panel.
Sure. I mean, it's a very interesting question, and I think in this industry, everyone says what they want to be is they want to be second, right? Not necessarily second to market, but if you have a new technology, you want someone else to pave that trail, pay for all the extra studies that may be required for the FDA to become comfortable with it. I mean, I think we can look to the example of protein sciences with the baculovirus expression system as to how they had to spend a lot of time and effort to work through that and to get that finally approved. And certainly the people who followed on their path that they forged, had a huge advantage. And I think we really need to think about how do we incentivize the leader to take charge and to get this approved. Is it giving them longer exclusivity, patent protection for their therapeutics if they are developing a novel path, or is there other ways of streamlining the approval process so that they start the conversations maybe earlier with respect to getting the government comfortable with the technology, so that there isn't this protracted approval process just because it's a novel breakthrough technological manufacturing process.
Sounds good. Other panelists have thoughts on this? Jeff, looks like you're eager to go.
Well, you want to expand on what you mean by protracted approval process for new and innovative technologies?
I mean, there's always, in a regulated industry, the government's job is to protect the population. And as a result, if something is new, they very much have a lot of unanswered questions that they will want to ask. And they rightfully so have the right to ask those questions and seek, the data to support the use. But that certainly does create a higher hurdle for that use of the manufacturing process as compared to I'm going to use CHO to make my protein, because CHO is well established, well reviewed, and the government is comfortable. So I think.
Let me respond to a couple of things. First of all, if you're coming in with a platform technology or a new innovative technology, the review cycle dates and the UFA dates are all the same in terms of how long a review is. If you come in with a breakthrough product or a priority review and you have new technology or you have platform technology, the review cycle is the same. I think that when we go through and look at RFIs, requests for information, questions from the agency, I think, and you do the breakdown, I'm talking for biologics now, I think that the number of questions that come in are far more a function of the quality of the application, the completeness of the application, than they are for the newness of the technology. So that's at least been my experience. Now, with regards to providing access, when you have new innovative technology, come in and have a discussion. In Cedar, the emerging technologies team has been in place for several years. For the longest time, we said, you know, we will not entertain discussions of technology outside an application for a specific product. And, you know, maybe that was a hurdle to some technologies. That guidance is published and finalized. Companies can approach FDA to the emerging technologies team and say, hey, we have a technology here that we think maybe you guys haven't seen before. Maybe your reviewers haven't seen it. And we want to talk to you about it and how well it works and how well we understand it and how well it's going. And that portal is available. And sometimes there are face-to-face meetings. Sometimes we send guys out to visit the plant. I think that surprises the company. Is this an inspection? No. You asked for our help. You know, you asked for our partnership in it. And you know, and the ETT has been going very well. This last year, Cedar has come out with a related program. So I'm pleased to say that there are portals available there for bringing in new innovative technologies, you know, and getting ahead of that. And then I think the last thing I'd add to give room to the other speakers is, you know, when we talk about the government providing incentives, you know, for innovation and advanced, well-controlled, well-characterized products, I hope that, at least in my experience, that the business case associated with having a well-characterized and controlled, capable, and highly predicted process far exceeds gaining a few weeks in a review cycle. Because we all have our development expenses, but the manufacturing operation is capital, and the value is realized its area under the curve. And there's physical capital and there's intellectual capital, our understanding of the process. And so I would hope that the value proposition would serve as a driving incentive for that. And if in fact that new technology does not enhance control, capability, predictability, and efficiency, you know, new for the sake of new doesn't have a lot of value. It needs to enhance control, capability, predictability, and stability. But
let me kind of get back to the core of the question, though, is how are we going to help the idea is that there's a high bar for the first mover, because there's extra investment and risk that's involved compared to the folks who follow. What can we do about, you know, keeping maybe lowering the bar or kind of sharing the investment, sharing the risk? And this is really, I'm kind of directing this more towards industry. How about industry partnerships, ways to share the technologies and intellectual property that's not necessarily proprietary, or things that companies can share across a platform to enable everybody to benefit from moving forward faster? Are there any innovative opportunities around that? And I'll turn it to the let's say Warren and Haroon, if you guys have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the way I think Jeff said it in the end is that technology in itself, sometimes it's just not because there is a shiny object out there, you have to go and kind of, you know, just adopt it. Like sometimes whether you are thinking from the first mover perspective or not, a technology becomes necessary to adapt for your purposes. Because, for example, like in some of the gene therapies and using viral-based assays, when you were looking for these replicated competent viruses, you are looking at cytopathic assays and cytopathic effect assays, and now the field is transitioning into sort of quantitative PCRs, which are fast. So if you are developing a product, that in itself is a value proposition for you, because it saves time in your development, it gives you more precise results, etc. So would you wait for somebody else to develop it when the value proposition for your drug development is right there? So sometimes it's better to think of technology that way, that, you know, are you ready to move forward? In terms of the hurdles that we face, so yes, there is a cost aspect to it. But if you have some technology that is working, and do you want to move into a new technology and you know, blaze the trail, the issue is the regulatory framework in which you have to address the comparability. And if you are moving into that next wave of technology, then what are the hurdles that you have to cross? Now the question is that I hope that the FDA, and that's where the incentivization and sort of having the level playing field, is that just because a company has done the legwork to establish the utility of generating the data and showing that this technology works for this purpose, would that bar be lowered for another company coming in and not to have to establish a similar level of data with their product? Would the technology work same and yield similar results with their product, so all of a sudden they would not be required? I don't think, Jeff can comment on it, I don't think FDA will cut them that big of a slack. So you know, sometimes it's a badge of honor to be the trailblazers and adopt a technology that you are the first ones to adopt that without necessarily doing a lot of work which other companies now will not be required to do because you have established the technology. I think from a regulatory framework, FDA still requires the other companies that are coming as a follow-on to establish a similar level of data with their product. Jeff, wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, I just want to jump in real fast and reassure everyone who's listening, applications are firewalled from one another. You know, your application comes in, that is your proprietary information and your data, you know, that you have submitted to the FDA. And we manage this all the time with biosimilars, you know, that you cannot use information in one BLA in the review of another one. Now, we do encourage good science, and good science is frequently founded upon citation of literature and peer review and other work. And if a company cites good science, you know, that's published, you know, of course that's appropriate. We all stand on the shoulders of giants, you know. But to say that there's, you know, I think that the risks are not so much linked. Are you first, second, or third to, do you know, how well do you know what you're submitting or you're not submitting? I mean, Deming, I'm a big Deming fan. You know, Deming said leadership is risky business. And I hope, though, that companies that represent as leaders, you know, extend that leadership to manufacturing. I think, you know, but I just want to be clear that there's not a misunderstanding that, hey, you know, the company that comes in first, they carry the load for everybody that comes in behind them. The people that follow, there is still an expectation that, you know, you provide assurance of safety and efficacy and the ability to make the product the same way over and over and over. But, you know, it is true that we always reference the work that has gone before, because that's the foundations of science. We don't start with a blank page when we embark upon a study.
Sounds great. Well, let's turn to another question here. The board here is pretty active in watching the tiles move around, and I see that COVID-19 question has gone right to the top here fairly quickly. So let's turn to that. The question is, the COVID-19 pandemic has ignited worldwide innovation to develop drugs and vaccines. Are you also seeing a surge in biomanufacturing innovation to rapidly expand production capacity? Examples. Let's see, Haroon, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, I think this is not at least applicable to us. We are more in a crisis mode. I think because our manufacturing facilities, of course, the CMOs of people that we are working with all have to deal with the situation. So I think at this point, it's also a matter of ensuring clinical trial supply, managing the ongoing clinical trials, and I'm sure the companies that have commercial products out in the market. So I think apart from, I would think that some question like this would be very highly applicable to the companies that are developing, especially working in the vaccine space to address COVID-19. But for other companies which are working in other therapeutic areas, right now we are trying to ensure that how do we kind of maintain our drug development timelines and the projects, and especially the clinical trial supply with the CMOs and manufacturers that may be impacted by COVID. That's my impression.
Sounds good. So Philip, in the area, and I understand you know, you're working in cell and gene therapy, contract manufacturing, but you probably have a view into the bigger picture of what's happening with contract manufacturing and the role they're going to play in producing millions of doses of therapeutics and vaccines. Insights there?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we do quite a bit of vaccine work as well. And I mean, because as Haroon said, the urgency of the moment is such, that everyone is pretty much trying to just move this forward at brute force as much as possible, relying on existing well-established technologies. The idea is not to take any time to really develop anything, beyond what is standard industry practice, because it's just much more important to get these manufactured than to perfect the manufacturing process.
Do you think that maybe we're learning some ideas and kind of taking notes for creating capacity for whatever the future pandemic is, so that we're ready for that next thing?
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I think certainly BARDA has done a really good job of, at least starting, us thinking about this many years ago, so that, we're not starting from zero, that there are mechanisms in place to try to accelerate and try to ramp up manufacturing. But we do have the capacity out there. We do have the know-how, and there will be a vaccine sooner rather than later, thankfully. It's assuming that it works in the clinic. We do have the manufacturing capacity available.
That's great. That's good news. Jeff, did you want to comment on that from the regulatory perspective?
Well, it's a busy time. I think the way that, first of all, with regards to providing specific examples, that would be inappropriate in this forum. The things that are going on. I think one of the things I'm observing with the COVID-19 response is almost a magnification effect. And I think the companies who are vested in being founded on sound science and highly effective engineering are finding that those are levers that are very much to their benefit. I think companies that have not really looked at the manufacturing sciences as a core capability, but rather as something we have to have in order to get our innovative new drug in the market, that is being amplified as well in terms of that level of understanding and effectiveness. I think that companies that have well understood, well characterized, robust and resilient supply chains the benefit of that is being magnified in the current environment. And I think companies that, and I'm picking an extreme to make a point, have JIT kind of seat of the pants, supply chains, the consequences of that are being magnified in the current environment. So I agree that the emphasis is on getting the drugs to the patient just as soon as humanly possible. Sometimes that innovative manufacturing manifests itself in terms of unit ops. Sometimes innovative manufacturing manifests itself in terms of risk management, project management, failure modes analysis, things of this sort. But I think I'll make a sweeping statement that companies that view manufacturing science and manufacturing excellence as a valid core competency find themselves at a position, on a very different position on the board right now than companies that have viewed manufacturing as an unfortunately necessary piece of overhead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Actually, you mentioned a interesting point there, just-in-time supply chain. It's not exactly biomanufacturing innovation, but it could be argued that some of our manufacturing capacity and possibly innovation has gone offshore. That's a topic in the press nowadays. Warren, is this something that I could ask you to maybe comment on about? Are we seeing biomanufacturing maybe onshoring in the near term?
Well, I'll give you my personal perspective is that my preference is to stay on shore for control and touch point. My recent experience has been with novel modalities, early stage. And when I'm transferring to a CDMO, I want to have high touch, and getting on a short plane ride is no problem. Crossing borders is an added complication. And then you have project management overlays of culture and time zones. So I think in the United States, I've found that we have adequate capability, both in capacity and skill, that I haven't need to go overseas, even to Europe in the recent years to achieve what I need to do on a manufacturing front. So my preference is strongly to keep it domestic. I touched back in maybe the earlier conversation about technology and needing to solve a problem, not doing it just because. If I can meet something domestically, I will. If I have to go external, into Europe or Asia, I will. But it has to be value driven and reason driven, not just for pennies on the unit. It's got to be overall cost, and that includes cost of quality and cost of management and risk. We often think of terms of things of fastest possible timeline versus fastest probable timeline. I like to think in terms of fastest probable, and that pushes me towards domestic interactions, which when things go sideways, a little easier to remit by getting on a plane and being there and talking to people face to face, because that's really how things happen.
With their masks on, right?
You're correct. Yes.
Sounds good. And Philip, in the area of manufacturing overseas, there's large things that are, let's say, mature products and APIs often get offshored. Do we see a movement to onshore those kind of APIs and so forth into our biomanufacturing plants here in the United States?
Well, I mean, Catalent is a global company. We have manufacturing locations across the world. I mean, I think there's advantages and disadvantages to manufacturing everywhere. And I think it depends upon the particular sponsor as to what makes the most sense for them as to the arrangement. There certainly is an advantage to manufacturing local, and certainly as a country, we need to focus on the ability to not be beholden in a time of crisis such as this. But I think there's pluses and minuses there.
Sounds good. Okay, well, let's go back to the board here. The next most popular question here is I'll just go ahead and read it. Speed to market and budget drive companies to tried and true manufacturing technologies for product launch with the intention to innovate later. Later almost never happens. What can we do to break the pattern? And I think Warren, you're the one who in our brainstorming session ahead of this mentioned the fact that later never happens. So why don't you take the lead on this one?
Yeah, again, speaking from personal experience is that I haven't seen later happen. We usually get over the next hurdle, the IND, et cetera, and especially with just good enough technologies, not fully robust manufacturing processes, you're often wed to those for the long term. You're patching holes, fixing problems, just to get that through your first IND, and then for later stage, you're again limping over the finish line necessarily if you haven't put the resources in early. So I think the challenge again is how do you bring the value proposition forward, and I like to frame things into validation is a confusing word versus qualification, but if you're validating for phase one, generally you've done too much, but often phase one development is minimal. And I think when you start thinking about the long term, hey, we're going to be running this process for phase two, phase three commercial. What can we do now to better understand the design space, robustness, supply chain interactions to de-risk the phase one? Often pays off later. But it's very hard to do in already accelerated timelines. So I think that's where viewing, Jeff mentioned it, viewing manufacturing on this end as a value core for an organization is key.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think if I can just add to it, the issue is that it should not come across as the industry is sort of averse to kind of adopting new technology. And yeah, I mean, it's the speed to market sometimes can be just seen in the context of that, you want to just commercialize the product and start making money. But there's also the concept of, especially if you're working in serious life-threatening diseases, orphan diseases, the access of life-saving drugs to the patients is also a big consideration. So one of the things that in my experience in terms of evaluating the sort of adoption of new technology, sometimes it's just science driven. As I mentioned before, that the technology that have been used is now outdated. You have better technology coming in that are going to serve the same purpose, and then if it's feasible, then you adopt it. I think the biggest issue then becomes is, which probably Warren was also alluding to, is that where you are in the stage of development, right? So if you are in phase one, and you have an access to a new technology that you can easily roll into your development plans and kind of generate the necessary data to kind of seamlessly continue on your development track, that's easy. But now if you are ready to embark on a pivotal study, and as Jeff will concur that, FDA said that when we are talking about adequate, well-controlled trials, we are not talking only in terms of the clinical trial design, but CMC is a big component of the studies being adequate, well-controlled studies. So at that stage, unfortunately, you cannot play with adopting a new technology, with generating the comparability package, etc., if there is a technology that is serving the need to ensure that your program that is moving along nicely in the development and the patients can have access to this drug if the pivotal trials are successful, then yes, you will by default think of that as a post-marketing change or something that you can adopt. And that's the rationale and the reason behind it, not just because you are averse to adopting something. And that's what in my experience, that's how we have looked at some of the things that have come along the way. That is this causing a lot of disruption at this stage in terms of the way that clinical trial is developing and where we are in the stage of development.
Yeah, I think Arun, you make a good point. I think it makes a lot of sense that even if you're for time and risk purposes, you're wed to an initial technology to start the planning early around comparability for change throughout your product lifecycle, and don't get surprised by a reactive change to less than desired outcomes from your manufacturing process. Mm-hmm. To have it baked in from the beginning, to expect it and to plan for it is going to be helpful. But that comparability planning is key to make sure that we can have continuity of the trials, yet continue to improve.
Philip, did you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%, but my question to the panelists would be, but is that really what goes on out in industry? Are they really spending the time to do that? Or do they get caught in a situation where they just, are happy with the first generation process and not work towards the second one because, it's more than they're willing to put in at that point in time?
No, I think it's, I would say that from my experience and something that we are in gene therapy, probably Warren can kind of validate that as well, that a lot of products, these viral vectors, et cetera, that were used were kind of a spin-off from academics and first generation. And there has been a lot of improvement in terms of the construct of the viral constructs, as well as the packaging cell lines that have addressed a lot of issues. So some of the companies, they started their development with this first generation viruses and packaging cell lines, and now things have evolved. And whether you like it or not, you have to make those changes because some of the challenges that were there in the manufacturing with early generations are going to persist if you are not going to make that shift. But then the question then becomes is within the risk benefit profile, when is the right time to make that shift? So if you are developing a drug with this first generation combination in a high unmet need condition where you can live with some of the challenges with those early generation product in the context of the risk benefit profile, maybe it's okay and it should be okay for the FDA to kind of continue with the development, but with an understanding that at some point the companies have to realize that it will be better off kind of switching to the next generation. And then how do you kind of make that transition? That just becomes a sort of a multifactorial way of thinking that where we are in the development, are we going to start a new indication with the same problems that we had before, or does it behoove us to kind of now start thinking of adopting those new technologies? So I think there is definitely a conscious decision-making process behind it, and not sort of, again, to that thing that, if everything is working, let's just keep moving forward with that and be averse to any change.
But what I see though is I see people making those changes, but they're small incremental changes. They're going from plasticware to a bioreactor. These are very tried and true processes in other realms of biologics. So and two, they're not really revolutionary in any way. They're just applying, taking what is the standards and elevating it based upon industry knowledge and understanding, but I don't see people going for cell and gene therapy, something very drastically different as they progress their product. And I don't even see them starting off with, I mean, the people that we were talking to 5 years ago to make gene therapy, we are seeing the same concepts of how they want to manufacture it now 5 years later, despite all the growth, all the rapid development that's going on in gene therapy. So I see changes, movement to bioreactor, going to ddPCR, but they're incremental. They're not revolutionary. They're not paradigm shifting. They are just making incremental changes. I mean, that's my perspective.
And I think that's a good point, and that goes back. I mean, my initial response again would be that again, to me, it's a matter of like how much disruption it's causing in your ongoing development versus, to your point, where you are initiating a development and then not kind of adopting the new technology. So I think the way to kind of overcome that hurdle in an industry FDA partnership would be to say that, okay, what is this next wave of potential innovation that can be adapted in the manufacturing, so that at least the companies that are now initiating development in whether it's cell therapy, gene therapy, protein therapeutics, whatever it is, that somehow not only an efficient way with a proper guidance from the FDA in terms of what would be the most efficient way to adopt that technology without disrupting your development plans, as well as like as a foresight that these are the technologies that are emerging. So for companies who would be initiating development or transitioning from research to development with their phase 1 studies, how can we encourage them to bring them on board, rather than me coming in and say, okay, this is the precedence that is set. I understand what the FDA's expectation is, so by default I'm going to adopt this technology rather than going with the new one. So I think maybe a little bit more upfront collaboration between the industry and the FDA would help to kind of identify in different areas that what are the technologies and how we should encourage and promote them, especially for the companies that are now transitioning from research to development, so they can right off the bat start with those technologies rather than getting stuck in the same sort of issue and that they have gone further down in the development, and now it becomes even more challenging to bring those technologies on board.
So let me ask, and let me just say, Philip, you actually introduced us to one of the other popular questions here, and I'll just read it, and then we'll springboard from there and continue the conversation. Biomanufacturing innovation is slow and incremental. How do we create conditions for disruptive innovation? And Haroon, I think you've put your finger on one of them, which is collaboration, I think with the regulatory bodies in order to identify areas of new innovation and kind of set standards in those areas to help the industry move forward. Are there other ideas that we have within the panel that we can bring forward about disruptive innovation? What can we do to change the game?
I think if you're asking the question, if you make the assertion, first of all, that in the biotech sector, all change is incremental, and you're going to make the assertion that disruptive change is desirable, how do you move to that? You have to first ask the question, why is change incremental these days? And it's a very broad sector, and I'll tell you, it is very incremental with many companies and in many types of products, but there's disruptive change that occurs. The biotech sector is very, very broad. From MOABs to CHO to gene therapy, drug antibody conjugate, enzyme replacement therapies, non-vaccine immunomodulators. There's disruptive innovation that occurs. And I think that when we ask how can we incent it, the better question would be, we're in the business of leveraging the molecular basis of life to impact public health. That's pretty disruptive. The better question would be is why are we locked into or feel that we're locked into an incremental development space? Because I have to say from where I sit, I do see an awful lot of innovation. And I think it really varies a lot with the strategies of the companies, the investment of the companies and understanding. Many companies have a decision phase development pathway that is differentiated from their commercial phase development pathway and manage that transition. The ability to initiate your development with a set of assays and launch with a different set of assays has been there for years. And the difficulty or the ease of making that transition is a function of your understanding of what matters and what doesn't matter. And if you're not clear on what's important and what's not important, yes, that's a very, very hard transition. If you understand what's clinically relevant, what's not clinically relevant, I have to tell you, it happens pretty regularly. And it's not unusual for us to have a BLA and in fact get 1, 2, 3 supplements a year for some time, many of which are CM&C. And it's not unusual for other companies to lock something in and then be married to it with, fastidiously, for an extended period of time. But I think the better question to ask, one is how do we encourage advanced innovation? But I think when we really ask ourselves the question, why do we find ourselves wed to this incremental innovation? That's where the solutions lie.
So let me just kind of maybe rephrase that question. Is disruptive innovation actually better innovation? Should we really be striving for that disruptive, or is it better to be fast failing and incrementally, taking less risks at each step, but making very fast steps?
I think it's what you're trying to prove, and technology is a tool. And if you're just applying the newest technology for the sake of it, you're not going to do it. In my career, we've pushed technology when we needed to, when it was important for getting the science done. And then you need to have the creative mindset of going against the norms and having conversations with the agency and taking risk. But in a lot of cases right now, the state of technology, although it's not optimal, it's sufficient. You can use an inherent-based production platform with serum to get AAV out at low titer and make your program. Should you for the long term? Probably not. For a lot of manufacturing reasons and control reasons, you can go to a suspension technology that's serum-free. But it's accessible, and it's not so wrong that you avoid on first blush. And so I think that the delta in the value proposition is closing in some areas. Do we need to chase innovation in every area, or are there different areas? And Jeff, you talked about it earlier. Is it just in the process, or is it in the program management and other aspects adjacent to manufacturing rather than just the physical kit?
Pretty intriguing there. Any question or last comments on that before we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, what I would say is that I think just science naturally, typically goes in increments, right? It's people build upon something that someone's built before. So I mean, so it is not surprising that most of the innovation, is going to be incremental innovation as people get to a point where they see a better way of doing a particular task and improve things. I think the question that's out there, and so you wouldn't expect, transformative change to be a frequent occurrence, but I think the question that's out to all of us is, are we doing things that are hindering our ability to bring transformative technologies out there that could have been implemented? The answer maybe no. Maybe, if it's really transformative enough, it bubbles its way up and it gets applied, to products, as soon as it's mature enough and ready to go. But I mean, there's also the possibility that because of, the nature of the technology, that it doesn't get the ability to be brought and utilized to its fullest as quickly as possible. I think it's an open question out there, but certainly, innovation typically happens, in incremental steps.
So I'm going to go out of order here because I know there's another question here that dovetails into Phil, what you're just saying though. Not too many years ago, it was not economically feasible to invest in certain rare diseases. There was the 21st Century Cares Act, and that kind of changed the game. And suddenly now it's economically feasible, and that's unlocked tons of innovation. If we could kind of reframe that kind of incentive package into biomanufacturing innovation, like not just the actual science of the the product, but the way that we make the product. Is there a way forward to achieve that disruptive technology advancements?
I'll take it first. I'll take it first. Sure, I'll take it first. What I will say is, I don't know is the answer to that particular question. But what I will also say is that the CARES Act undoubtedly has accelerated the amount of new transformative products in rare and orphan diseases. I mean, I think I don't know if there's anyone that would debate the fact that, you know, the amount of investment that's gone into this particular sector has dramatically increased because of the legislation and the incentives to now tackle what was before, you know, not a very attractive financial indication to go after. So I think the question out there is very valid, is that can we do something similar for innovative technology? But there's also the question, really, is there a lack of innovative technology that would warrant you know, such a special treatment?
Thoughts? Jeff, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, and I want to apologize a little bit. Y'all were cutting in out there a little bit. I don't know if it's just me or if it was cross board. Right. You know, I think that, yeah, views expressed as a speaker. I think that the value proposition of the technology that is the commercial driver. Okay, I think that's important for regulatory agencies to enable the application and the implementation of scientifically driven, good engineering practice, well-characterized processes and take it in. You know, I think there's also a fair amount of money flowing into funding innovation and manufacturing and biopharmaceuticals these days. And I'm seeing a lot of exciting stuff happening at university centers. Exciting stuff is occurring at non-for-profits, new part of the space coming out, public-private partnerships. And you know, and I think that a lot of times it's framed around process intensification. And I think we can agree that process intensification, it gives us a lot of flexibility in the supply chain. It changes the capital footprint and the fungibility of the capital. And I think that intensified processes are also easier and more efficient to characterize. And again, that characterization and that understanding and knowledge lowers regulatory hurdles. To be able to come in and say, I understand my product, I understand my process, and here's my data. Man, I'd love to take those meetings. Those are great meetings. Okay. And I think that there's a lot of trends in those directions, and the incentives are there. If you know the lack of fund, I think that the things are moving forward in that regard. I see a lot of risk aversion. Now, I don't know that there's a congressional act that can manage risk aversion in a conservative industry, but you know, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on. It'll be exciting to see it actually move into commercial manufacturing.
Sounds great. It's very hopeful there. So let me pick up one of these questions here. We have a number of questions with 5 votes, but ties into the intensification question and the assertions made that continuous manufacturing, Pharma 4.0, intensification, factory of the future, they're all buzzwords that get mentioned at conferences and the industry press, yet biomanufacturing innovation is slow and incremental. Why is that, and what can we do to change the game? And Jeff, I think you kind of painted a let's say a half full picture. It's actually going okay. Is that what we're seeing across the panel?
Can I jump in, Charlie? I'm sorry. I think there is a delta value between what can be and what we're actually seeing on the floor. But there's a lot of exciting stuff going on right now. So yes,
what do we do to convert the exciting stuff into reality?
Yeah,
that's the big question. How do we close that gap? Any ideas out there? Warren?
No real ideas, just on progress, more on barriers. When I think about, application of technology, again, it's got to be value driven, but the cycle for implementation is also long. The decisions made today on the manufacturing front, no matter what the intent or the value are sticky. They're going to stick with me at a minimum for 2 or 3 years. So the cycle change is always hard to say, hey, what am I going to do different? Because once you get wed to a starting line, you're going to be with it for a while. And it's going to be 80 or 90% of your focus, even if you are looking over your shoulder for what can I do better in the future, et cetera. So that's where I was thinking on this. I don't have any other thoughts.
Is there ways, okay, so there's an interesting idea. Are there ways to, you're kind of making the assertion that capital investment kind of locks you down to a certain technology set for a period of time until you gain the value out of that capital investment. That's basically kind of finance approach. Is there a way that we could design our technology so that it's interchangeable? So now you build the physical plant, but the components or the software that runs it is updatable with just doing a software update or incrementally putting things in there that don't require a huge capital investment?
Well, I think some of that exists under SUPEC guidances for small molecules already for scale up and post-approval changes, that there's somewhat of a roadmap to say you can make these changes and have some regulatory freedom for annual updates. I don't think we are yet at a stage of process understanding, and with products by process in the biologic side, I think it's harder to get to that point, but it would be aspirational to have a better roadmap, however developed, industry, agency, collaborative, to say that here's where things are fungible, and here's where you can make changes down the road. Again, it goes back to comparability. Again, even if you can change the biomanufacturing unit op, how are you assured from an organizational and risk standpoint that my product's still the same?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Arun. Yes.
No, I think it's I keep coming back to from a small company perspective again. I mean, one thing, it's the reality is the reality. You don't have the luxury of the resources, whether it's the human resources, not that you don't have the scientific intellectual capability to adapt to a new change. You have brilliant scientists working on it, but again, going back to the point is that, do you have enough funds to kind of bring about the new change without, and when, again, I keep bringing the concept of disruptive, that it's not disruptive that you are trying to disrupt the old method with a new method, but what are you doing in terms of the disruption of the development? And then going back to Warren's point is where are we in the process of development and how feasible it is to bring about that change? And I would say that even cost aside, that if it's resulting in a better yield, it gives you better science, but it really hampers your development because of the comparability that you have to establish, whether it's going from analytical, whether the clinical trial development have you done and the data that you generated to date, how feasible it would be to how seamlessly to adopt the technology, makes a huge difference in terms of the uptake of that technology. And yes, I mean, the reality, especially people who work in small companies, know that the finances is a big component to it, because yes, you may want to do it, but the reality is that you just don't have the resources to do it. And to the point that was made before, that it's not that the system that is there, it's not working. Yes, you would like to get there, but right now you just don't have the bandwidth to get there because either it disrupts your development or you just don't have the resources to adopt it.
Right. So, looking at the top question here, it's got 7 votes, and actually it really can address, Harun, what you just mentioned, the fact for a small company may not have the resources to do innovation. Most small companies use CMOs or CDMOs in the process of developing their drugs. So let's just kind of turn to this question here. What role does CMOs and CDMOs play in developing and introducing innovative manufacturing technology? What can be done to make CMOs and CDMOs into engines of biomanufacturing innovation? So, Philip, you want to go pick up on that, but I'll ask Philip also to comment too.
Or maybe we'll go with Philip and then I can comment on it.
Sure.
Okay.
What I will say is that I think actually CDMOs are one of the engines of biomanufacturing innovation, and I think even more than engines of biomanufacturing innovation, what they are is a distributor, right? So whether we come up with something or maybe a potential customer of ours come up with an innovative technology, we then are able to, within the confines of IP protection and things like that, start to take those, leverage those learnings on how to do things better and apply those to all the subsequent customers. So we certainly are, if not an engine of innovation, we certainly are a means of distributing the technology and getting more to think about and applying new concepts that they may not have been thinking of. As an example, when we started doing gene therapy manufacturing back in 2015 and 16, what we did was we had been spending a lot of years manufacturing virus-like particles using suspension cells. The way we were manufacturing those virus-like particles was transient transfection of multiple plasmids into 293 cells. As gene therapy started to take off, and a lot of these innovative companies were licensing technologies from academia, what they were using in those academic settings were adherent cells with serum in plasticware, using ultracentrifugation for purification. So we were able to create a value proposition where customers saw the utility of getting into something that looked more industry standard and acceptable, something similar to what you would do with proteins and antibodies in order to manufacture their viral particles. So very much, I think CDMOs have a place to play. But again, our focus is in manufacturing the products and developing the processes for our customers. We typically don't have the bandwidth to spend a lot of R&D in developing new technologies, disruptive technologies. Although there is somewhat of a budget for that type of thing, but it's not going to be what you would see from a pharma company or something similar.
Arun?
Yeah, I think my personal view on this would be that they could play a huge role in there. And the perspective that I would give that, look, a lot of innovation from a therapeutic side of view is coming from small startups, as people know, like, spin-offs and small companies coming up. And we heavily rely on CMOs and CMOs, right? So the majority of these small companies do not have their own manufacturing facilities, and they are relying on these. So people go, and these small companies search out for the CDMOs and CMOs who can do the development for them or manufacture the product for them. And I think this also kind of plays into the point that Warren was making earlier in terms of offshore and onshore, is that the value proposition, again, doesn't necessarily, in seeking out the CMOs and CDMOs, does not necessarily always depend on the financial consideration, but who can provide you the better science, who has more established in terms of their regulatory processes, so that once you go there, you can be comfortable that you will not run into regulatory hurdles. So I think that is one partnership between the FDA and the CMOs, CDMOs that can be in terms of adapting new technologies. Because if I as a company go to a CDMO, and yes, they can inform us that these are the new sort of the technologies that are being adapted for the product that you are developing, my first question would be that, where are your processes in terms of the GMP, et cetera, in terms of how would I be able to satisfy the FDA if I adopt the technology that your company is offering me. So I think in terms of the collaboration and partnership between the FDA and CMOs, at least will facilitate small companies that go and seek their help in terms of the manufacturing to kind of ease that sort of technology in, and ensuring that they also will have a relatively smooth pass with the FDA in terms of the interacting, if they have already established those standards within the CMOs that will satisfy the regulations and the regulatory framework.
So let me ask on those lines. It's kind of, I'm sorry, just similar along these lines. So you mentioned about kind of helping the regulatory bodies helping kind of matching. Right Is the market efficient today in helping small companies that have an innovative idea link with the right CMO or CDMO that's really going to help them leverage their technology into a commercial product? Is that matching efficient, or is that something that's a struggle that that industry finds in connecting to the right partners?
I think it's part of necessary due diligence. I don't know if there's a shortcut. What I find is that you have to do the shoe leather. And previous experience with a great CDMO from previous lives doesn't necessarily apply to this instance. But experience and knowing, being aware of what's available and who's moving in what direction and investing is critical. But it takes time to, I think, vet the extent of players that are capable of providing services for the ones that meet your needs best. And those are often both short-term needs, who can say yes to my timeline, but also who can best help us shepherd this program for the long term, and help us innovate, drive down costs, ensure robustness, et cetera, and be a good partner. Because as Arun said, you know, we're bringing the science to small companies, not necessarily the manufacturing. We really rely as small innovation centers on the CDMOs for bringing the manufacturing in.
And I interrupted you. Did you have another point there too?
Yeah, I think earlier, you know, I think it's CDMOs can be a key point of leverage for this, for a number of fronts, as Arun was talking about with the agency. But I think there's also opportunity for sharing of risk between industry and CDMOs in collaborative arrangements that provide some short-term protection for the sponsor, but yet an incentive for the CDMO to take on the capital expense or the risk expense for getting into new technologies. And instead of a transactional approach, which is which services you to provide off the menu, let me select from A, B, and C, talk about it more in a partnership way. Here's where we are, here's where we want to go. And I think it's incumbent on the sponsor to have those conversations with the CDMOs to talk about the long term, not just the short term. So if incentives are focused on the CDMOs, I do think it's a great place for leverage for change.
Excellent. Okay, let's move on to the next question here. Shifting focus over to regulatory bodies. Second question here that I'll just read it. The Cedar Emerging Technologies Program and the Cedar Interact Program are intended to support innovation in design and manufacturing. What has been industry's response? Examples of success stories. So Jeff, you want to lead on that one? I think you have a perspective on it.
Yeah, I'm pretty involved in some of that. I'm much more familiar on the Cedar side than on the Cedar side. I can tell you that I think the emerging technologies team for Cedar has been a success story. I think that it's been a success on several fronts. I think one of the biggest impact is being able to tell companies, don't be afraid of coming forward. That looks great. Sound science, good engineering, keep going. And companies want that encouragement earlier in the game, okay? I also think that it's been a good self-policing activity. When something is in the Emerging Technologies Program in our shop, there is an emphasis on having the appropriate technical background, reviewers of the appropriate technical background involved, particularly if it's something new. We, if at all possible, avoid, you know, this is the way we've always done it from the dadgum reviewer, you know. So it's been very effective, I think, in helping us try to avoid having internal blind spots. I'll have to say that in my experience, the majority of the impact of the ETT and Cedar has been on the small molecule side. There have been biologic projects come in, but a lot of the innovation, and I include disruptive innovation, whether it be from the biosource, you know, transgenics, whatever, all kinds of great things are coming in, even novel container closure systems. They tend to come right into our office rather than through the ETT. That is fully appropriate and as well. I don't have experience on the Cedar side with how they're doing. I will say that Cedar implemented the ETT probably, what, 3-4 years ahead of where Cedar did. And there's always some maturing in a startup, that has to happen with a lot of these things. But I think that's been a real success story, and I'll tell you that's being expanded upon and built upon within Cedar. Anything that we can do to not do the development for companies, but to say when you have good science, sound engineering practice, that is the basics and the fundamentals of what you're bringing forward. And we don't want just being new to in any way get in the way of bringing something forward. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it's turning along. I will say in the biotech space, an awful lot of innovation comes right into the Office of Biotech Products without going through the ETT.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's a great. I appreciate your innovation, your perspective about how it actually strengthens your team too, by having the right reviewers and bringing challenging your own team to embrace new technology. I think that's really interesting. For the
oh, absolutely. Yeah, I would just add that in the beginning when we started doing this, a lot of us thought, oh, good Lord, here's another layer. Here's another level of complexity and involvement. This is going to be a mess. And I was wrong, okay? It's worked very well. There's been a very strong partnership. I think it's really helped move a lot of things forward. And Larry Lee, who's the chair of the Cedar ETT, should get a lot of credit for his leadership in that regard.
Great. Well, how about our industry partners? Have you experienced either of these programs, and what's your experience, or what's the industry perspective on it? Any success stories?
No experience.
From my perspective, at CBER level, this Interact was basically like especially for oncology products, they used to have pre-INDs, which was kind of the same concept. With especially on the preclinical models when you are developing products that don't have anything, but yes, you can cover clinical and CMC topics in there too. So Interact is in a way was another sort of way of positioning the pre-IND. But I would use the FDA's kind of it's always, to me, it's always case by case, and that's what it turns out to be, that you just have to determine where does it fit in, where does your technology fit in, and as Jeff just alluded to, that FDA says that we are not your consultants, so you have to come with a proposal. What's your plan? What is it going to do? And if you are already in development, then so I think the industry has to think through it. These options are there. The Interact meeting allows you that sort of unofficial discussions which does not preclude you from having a pre-IND after that as well. So I think that avenue is there, but then it's just up to you to determine that, do you have the sort of value driven out of it, then what would you get out of it in those interactions? Yeah, but I think we have not approached it yet because we were in development, but I think that opportunity is there for companies that are in a sort of an innovative technology, adapting innovative technology, or even an innovative product for they may not have like predefined preclinical models, or the manufacturing is very unique aspects. I would highly encourage that they use that, just like we have used pre-IND before, but I think Interact allows, at least on the CBER front, allows a little bit more informal early engagement before you put yourself on a certain track.
Right. So kind of building on that, we have a question from Jamit. How do companies developing innovative, oops, I just changed on my screen here.
Hi, I dropped out of there. I appear to be back. Sorry.
Okay, here we go. All right. How do companies developing innovative technologies for biopharmaceutical manufacturing obtain regulatory feedback on key factors to consider for supporting efficient implementation into the industry? Now, it's kind of similar to the questions we just asked. These two emerging technologies and the Interact programs, and having early meetings. But really, I think what I wanted to get out of this question is, let's say you have those meetings, okay? Your team is going to go in to talk to the FDA about your biomanufacturing innovation. How can you make that meeting most effective? And I'm interested in kind of hearing from the regulatory side and from the industry side. What can you get? What magic can you make in that meeting?
Yeah, so I think from a process point of view, like especially I think the way I'm looking at this question is that if you are already in development, so if you take the pre-IND interact type of interactions out of the way, and now you're development, then from a CMC perspective, from a process oriented, there's the Type C meeting, right? So you have the Type C CMC specific meeting, and you put all your arguments, you kind of lay out your plan, you ask your specific questions, and either you get a written response or your face-to-face meeting or telecon, whatever you get. So that is probably the most standardized procedure. The other way we have utilized before, but I don't think that would be really helpful for complex matters that has a lot of, say, for example, comparability discussion. You may reach out to the reviewers, like the CMC reviewer, if you have questions, and you can provide some context. But you can understand that if there is a lot behind it, right? So then unfortunately that quick email interaction with the CMC reviewer may not be as useful. And then it will come back, to be honest, with caveats that, based on the information that we have provided, that's what it seems like. But it will depend on the review. And then you are left wondering, so do they agree or they do not agree? So I think you have to make a judgment call as to what's the scope of the feedback that you're looking for. And if it is something major like adopting a new technology that impacts your comparability, that impacts your new clinical trial material that will be used, and so on and so forth, then potentially Type C meeting where you can provide that full context to the agency, and you can be assured that when you walk away with the answers, that's the path that will not disrupt your registration path or development path would be important. I think that would be my take on that.
Any other experiences in meeting with the agency in these kinds of meetings?
I would echo what Harun said. You've definitely got to own your science, have a framework of what you expect to get out of it, and make sure you've got a proposal that they can speak to, and it can't just be an open-ended "will this work" sort of question. So it does take some considerable prep on the sponsor side to prepare for those, often in times of development uncertainty, and that's often the challenge that's faced, is how do you get to that specific ask when you still are in development and figuring out where you're going with these things. But it's going to make the interaction most fruitful.
Yeah. And Philip, you've had some meetings like this too, I'm sure.
Sure. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's all science-based, right? I mean, if you have real science to back up what you're doing and why you're doing it, I think things go relatively smoothly. If you have a lot of unanswered questions, that just, creates doubt in the minds, right? So it's all about getting the science, getting the data, understanding what you are proposing.
Jeff, your thoughts from the other side of the table.
Yeah, I apologize. I seem to be cutting in and out, so I apologize to the group. I don't know, the NSA is watching or something, I don't know. But I think that, let me say this. Let me tell you what a good meeting is. We have a lot of meetings. A good meeting is when a company comes in and says, here's where we are, here's what's going on, this is the problem we're confronting, here are our concerns, this is where we think we want to go for all of these reasons. Gosh, do you think we've missed anything? That's a good meeting. I'll tell you another good meeting is when they come in, a company comes in and says, we have the following challenge in front of us. Here's our data. Here's where we're going with this and why we're going there. Does the agency agree? Here's where we are. Does the agency agree? You're always going to be better off coming in, explaining the situation, saying we've done our homework, we've done our analysis, here's where we're going, and then asking the question. Okay. There are other meetings, sometimes where things are so extensively wordsmithed that it's hard to understand what the question for the agency is. And we've all been in those meetings. It's always better off to come in, good science, good engineering. Here's the problem in front of us. Here's what we're going to do. Here's where we think we want to go. Have we missed anything? Everybody wants to do a good job. Nobody comes to work in the morning. Very few people come to work in the morning trying to scam something away. Everybody wants to do a good job. And I think that open, honest, forthright, risk-based, patient-centered discussion is always the path forward. And particularly in this environment, as the biosimilar sector grows, the concept of clinical relevance is entering into all of our discussions. X, Y, and Z is different. Well, is that clinically relevant? If the answer is, I don't know, the conversation is going to go one direction. To come in and say, we have these differences, but you know, we really don't think these are clinically relevant for the following reasons. That's a different discussion. Okay, and I think that's a good direction to see things be moving in. So that's my, that in a buck will get you 4 quarters, but that's my advice for a good meeting. Here's where we are, here's where we think we need to go, here's why. Gosh, have we missed anything?
Sounds good, sounds good. So I have a question here, and it's a couple notches down here, but it's related. The FDA and other agencies have encouraged a scientific risk-based approach for improvements or innovations in biopharmaceutical manufacturing. Why does the industry still hesitate to innovate? So I guess the idea here is, ICH9 has been out for a long time, and the encouragement around the risk-based approach, but yet there is the tendency towards sticking to the tried and true path. My parents did it this way, so I'm going to do it this way, and not stepping off the track. How can we kind of break that chain?
I have an old guy answer. I'm going to jump in. I think that we really need to reinvest in developing manufacturing sciences and process development as a technical expertise. And is that where we have our A team these days? And I think that with knowledge and confidence in our science engineering, that brings security in a risky environment. But when you ask people to come in for a risk-based decision, say, what do you see as the major risks here? And you see panic on their face because the answer is, I don't know. Or when you come in and say, gosh, do you think this is clinically relevant? Is this going to impact the patient? There are a lot of possible answers. But probably not the best one is, I don't know. And I think that's not an indictment. I mean, very frequently we get fabulous answers. But I go back to this idea of manufacturing sciences as a core capability. People that understand their process and that understand their product and the relationship between the process and the product have a competitive advantage because they're working in a knowledge space rather than a risk space. Now, again, maybe that's an old guy answer, but that's my point of view.
Okay, so you say being better at manufacturing sciences. How do you kind of spark that into industry? Is that in university training, or is that an OJT kind of activity where you kind of get it through osmosis? What's the best way?
That's a good question. I think one of the things I don't know the answer. I'll tell you one of the things we talk about a lot, and in fact, it's discussed in the recent FDA position paper on drug shortages, is that there is a disconnect sometimes between commercial and financial incentives and high quality, stable, robust, in control and capable operations. And I think that examining that and finding a way to rebuild a bridge between incentives for the market and market access and things like that, and really well characterized, robust processes is a path forward, and that the industry will respond and react to that. But that's a really good question. But I think that you learn a lot about a company, doing due diligence where you learn about the companies. Where do they have their A team? And if they have their A team making fabulous PowerPoint slides, or their A team developing incredible clonal constructs, or their A team making medicine for the patient, that's going to tell you a lot about the company.
So industry partners, a lot of what you do is not just invent drugs and manage, but you also mentor people. You hire young professionals and you bring them along into the industry. What are some of your thoughts on best practices to instill the risk-based approach in developing professionals? Warren, are you gonna? Can I ask you?
I suppose I'll jump in. I think experience on the job training is extremely valuable. And with that, you can learn a lot from failure. Having the opportunity to see things go sideways is often an acceleration point for learning. We often go through a lot of experiences not knowing what we got away with. And when you start thinking statistically, you're playing Russian roulette with a gun. And a process that's okay, you have a few bullets in the chamber that just haven't fired yet. And eventually, if you operate that process long enough, those bullets are going to fire. And then you'll have the pain at the most unexpected point in the operation. Occam's razor, Murphy's Law, whichever one it is there. But I think that experience instills, and I can speak from personal experience on that, I'm not going to do that again belief. But I think there also needs to be more value in understanding the fundamentals of building quality in. And Jeff mentioned Deming earlier at one point. It might have been pre-meeting. I'm a big fan of Deming and Durand, and going back to that, and I think we have a little bit of buzzword bingo overlays of Six Sigma and ICH and QBD, and we get wed to we've run through a risk-based process, but we don't understand anymore. We've filled out the FMEA, and we have all this information, we have all this data, but we don't have any more information. We don't fundamentally understand our process, and we haven't connected it to value, whether that's business value and or clinical value, clinical relevance. So I think that mindset, that education, I see it lacking. It's not common, and I think you see it more in supply chain, maybe outside of pharma, than you do see in pharma.
Philip, any thoughts on that?
No, I agree 100%. I mean, what I'll say is I have noticed a much more of a focus from some universities to really actually train for this manufacturing, and it's very, very needed and a very positive development. I would also say that I'm biased, but experience at a CDMO can go a really long way with respect to training. The fact that you get to see a lot of different programs, and some will be successful and some won't be, and that learning experience is invaluable. I had a mentor who once said that CDMO years are like dog years. So just several at a CDMO could be a lifetime in industry. So I just put out there that if you really want to understand manufacturing, get your hands on it, see things go well, see things go sideways. CDMO is a great place to learn.
Sounds great. Well, I think we're up for our last question here. So let me do this, and we do a quick speed round, and we'll pull it together. The question is, when the manufacturing unit is operated as a cost center, management focuses on quarterly targets for quality production and cost reduction. Innovation takes a back seat. What can we do to change this? So basically focusing on how where manufacturing is a cost center, it drives this focus on cost reduction rather than investment in innovation. Is there any way to kind of break that chain?
Yeah, I can take that by saying that I don't think it's really that black and white. That I think there are definitely lots and lots. It's a multifactorial decision. And just to put it in a black and white terms, that just the cost center aspect is preventing innovation probably may not be the accurate way to put it.
Okay.
I think I'd push back a little, Haroon. I think that it may vary from organization to organization. I think that when you look at manufacturing as a cost center, costs are discrete and much easier to quantify and manage than value. And so sometimes it takes us to an environment where we're minimizing costs rather than optimizing value. Despite what we all say, when you look at what's actually measured, okay? And I compare the prevalence of the P&L sheet to the prevalence of a value stream map, in an organization.
That's a good point.
So I think when you minimize costs, you're always going to end up with a very conservative perspective as opposed to optimizing value.
Right. No, so from a governance point of view, within all my years of experience in the industry, like when any kind of innovation, manufacturing, or any decision in any area is being made, yes, definitely, that's why I'm saying the reality of cost is always there and will always be there. We cannot get rid of it. But like if I'm the leader of an organization, whether a CMC group or a regulatory group, and if I'm coming to a proposal to the leadership team or as a leadership team sitting down and looking at it, then yes, cost it is, but the value proposition is based on determining like where we product, what efficiency it's going to make, is it going to help us with the yield of the product? And so there is a trade-off. There is a trade-off, and at some point you do take that cost, because the trade-off in terms of the efficiency, in terms of the science, it kind of outweighs the cost that you're doing. In other cases, what you see is unfortunately the cost outweighs the value proposition that that technology is adding to it. So in the governance of the organization, those decisions do not become that black and white. Cost is definitely a driver, especially as I kind of agreed for small companies right up front that it does make a big difference. Probably not as much as in the big pharma and big biopharmaceutical companies, but there is a sort of the whole matrix that you have to go through and determine that whether that investment is going to bring you the value that you want.
Yeah, and what I'd add to that, I think it's a little bit, it's an asymmetric argument in cost versus value, because cost is usually known and value is always future discounted and unknown. So the value proposition in a perfect world of information, you're not making those decisions on that margin, you're making it on a much higher value proposition margin to account for the delta in knowledge of the future payoff and the lack of knowledge about certainty. So the value component has to be larger than just the straight cost value judgment would say.
Also, cost is a discrete event. Value is realized over a long period.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to, Philip, you'll have the last word on this one. From a larger organization perspective, is there a different calculus than, so Harun, as kind of representing the smaller organization, and but when you have large plants, a lot of people involved, and the capital investment is really substantial. Does the cost driver tend to overrun the innovation? Does it win out in the battle?
I think it depends on the culture of the company. I mean, our focus is we have a patient-first mentality. So at the end of the day, what does this mean to the patient, and that becomes the driver for our decisions. If something creates value and is better for the patients, then that's the way that we would approach it. But at the end of the day, if reducing costs means that more patients can get it, then that certainly has value.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate you joining me tonight. It was an excellent conversation. I learned a lot myself, and I'm sure that our audience appreciates it. Let me just close up here now. Thank you to our speakers for sharing their expertise, and thanks everyone for participating in today's webinar and for your interest in ISP's Boston area chapter educational programming. You will receive a follow-up email with a short survey. We would appreciate your feedback. You'll also receive an email with a link to view the recording of today's webinar, and it will also be on the YouTube channel in about a week. On behalf of ISP Boston, thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you to our sponsors, DPS Group, ICQ Consultants, and Massey Bioservices. Thank you and have a great evening. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you, gentlemen.